Welcome to the Integrated Intelligence Podcast. I'm your host, Azrya Bequer. The exponential modernization of our world has led to a widespread belief system that success is the byproduct of intellect. I think, therefore I am. But many of us are no longer buying into this limited definition of what it means to be human. The curious amongst us have instead been called to explore our original AI, ancient intelligence, and the many intelligence systems that make up our reality. Intuitive, somatic, collaborative, environmental, and so many more. Join us as we speak to leading authors, innovators, and culture creators dedicated to reconnecting humanity to the essential aliveness that goes far beyond the thinking mind. Welcome, I'm so happy that you're here. My name is Azrya, and today I want to just share why I decided to make this podcast, the Integrated Intelligence Podcast. And there's been an internal battle, I guess, that I'll start with transparently around having a podcast, because it feels like there's a lot of podcasts in the world. It feels like there's no shortage of information out there and no shortage of conversations that one could tune into at any given moment. In some ways, I feel that the avalanche of digital content and options is really overwhelming the collective nervous system. Personally, I feel this in a big way. And there's almost an option paralysis that can come from not knowing where to even point our awareness and our energy when there's so many things happening in the world and so many people sharing solutions to, massive problems and challenges from so many conflicting perspectives. But I felt like when I look at the world and I see the social crisis that we're all a part of, regardless of how privileged we might be, we're all part of the same fabric that creates the societal structures that we live inside of. And I see the confusion that's arising, and I see the questions that seem unanswerable and the divide amongst humans that seems to be growing. This theme of integrated intelligence has felt really like an important puzzle piece to contribute to the larger narrative around what's really happening right now in this moment of exponential modernization, which ultimately has led us to really an extreme state of distraction, isolation, and ultimately fragmentation, like a disconnection, a systemic disconnection from ourselves, our intuition, our bodies, our hearts, nature, the planet, and each other, which has rippled into really this whole way of life that we all have, I think, moved along with as if it were normal. And many of us now are questioning whether that really is the way that we want to live. And we'll talk a little bit more today about really what the journey is from what we call default intelligence to integrated intelligence. This theme of ultimately transformation, internal transformation, which ultimately then leads to external ripples of impact. That is the heart of what we're going to be covering in the various podcast episodes. And I guess I really want to share that I'm not so interested in focusing on the problems. I think there's lots of places to learn about all the things that are wrong with the world and the sort of doom and gloom scenarios and the world is on fire and we must do something to fix it or solve it. I'm not necessarily going to spend a lot of time there. I think if we can just agree that some of the systemic root causes of the challenges we face today are the ones I named earlier: distraction, isolation, and fragmentation of the self, ultimately, of our own relationship to ourself, which then mirrors back in everything outside of us. Then we can start to really proactively look at the solutions and the opportunities that are available in this breakdown moment. Because to me, everything that's happening right now in our collective, in our shared human experience, isn't a mistake. It's not the result of us having messed up horribly as a species, but it's really an evolutionary process. And evolution goes through sometimes very extreme cataclysmic events in order for life to continue to evolve into the next iteration. And I think we as humans have this opportunity, this choice point moment to really decide, how do we want to meet what's happening? How do we want to show up in response to what's happening? And so my intention is that the conversations that you'll be experiencing in this podcast will help you answer that question for yourself and find your own definition and your own experience of integrated intelligence. I want to share that I really don't believe I have the answers, or anyone in my organization has the answer. I think we're explorers, we're apprentices, we're curious about really the human existence and all of reality and why it is the way it is, and we're here to question all of it. And I really believe that discernment and doubt actually have a really powerful role to play in this as well. In some of the more spiritual ways of thinking, there can be a lot of emphasis on eradicating doubt and going 100% into faith, or 100% into trust, 100% into belief. I personally think that doubt is sacred, just like all the other emotions, and doubt is pointing us in a direction and forcing us to ask deeper questions. So if you're questioning your reality, if you're questioning why you're here, what you were put on this earth to do, maybe you already have a clear direction, and maybe you're at the beginning of your journey. But if you're here, I'm going to go ahead and assume that you're probably a purpose-driven entrepreneur, maybe a conscious creative. You're someone who feels deeply and who cares ultimately about others and about the world at large, and who wants to make a mark, and who wants to leave this world more beautiful than you found it. So again, my hope is that this podcast will maybe provide a little bit of guidance, a little bit of insight, a little bit of inspiration on your path. So I'd love to share a little bit of my personal story of how I got here to be even talking about these things. And again, the theme being sort of distraction, isolation, fragmentation. When I look at my journey from default intelligence to integrated intelligence, which I'm still very much on, by the way, I don't think there's any sort of endpoint when it comes to integrated intelligence. There's always more intelligence systems to discover, to unlock, and to integrate. But in my personal experience of that process, I think I came into this world as a person who always had the ability to feel at a pretty deep level. That connection that is kind of the antidote to isolation and even fragmentation was something that was innate in my childhood. And I think a lot of children, unless we're born into like very, very traumatic environments, which many of us are, but generally the spirit of a child is intact. And that innate connection to all things, that feeling of being one with all things, the awe and the wonder and the ability to see the beauty of life is a natural part of being a child. And so that childlike aspect of me in some ways is more alive now than it ever was, because what I realized when I was about 10, 11, growing up in Germany in a fairly sheltered environment, and I made the move back to the US, and in that transition and coming into a school and a kind of societal structure that was much more focused on appearances than I was used to, and there was a lot more sort of playing the part of the cool girl that was needed in order to fit in. And when I failed at that, because I didn't have the tools and I didn't have the self-awareness at that point to even know what was considered cool and what wasn't, when that broke down, I got to really touch what it feels like to be isolated. So in that chapter of my life, it was kind of like this bubble burst moment where this fairy tale that I had been living inside of just disappeared, and all of a sudden I was faced with a more probably accurate representation of the quote-unquote real world. I got to really tap into and connect with this sense of isolation. I felt totally alone and separate from my classmates, from this whole sort of culture, and I didn't know how to play the game. I didn't understand the rules of the game. I didn't know how to fit in. And maybe you can relate to this. Many of us go through this in our teenage years. In hindsight, I'm actually deeply grateful, because I think if I didn't have that visceral felt experience of being the weird girl that no one wanted to talk to, not knowing how to strike up conversation, rehearsing every word in my head before I would speak it out loud because I was so afraid that if I said the wrong thing, I would be judged. That process gave me such a profound contrast and really helped me understand the spectrum from disconnection and isolation all the way to total connection, a total sense of belonging, a total sense of being one with all things. On that spectrum, because they're two sides of the same coin, I was able to touch sort of both extremes of that polarity in a significant way. And because I didn't have the tools, as many of us don't, I thought, well, the way out of the pain of this, the only way out that I could see was to try and care less, right? All the examples, all the pop culture references we have of the cool person is literally cool, like not passionate, not sort of engaged emotionally, but more just like, whatever, I don't really care what you think of me. And I idolized that. I wanted to genuinely not care. I wanted to genuinely not give a flying F. And I spent many years all through high school pretending not to care and trying to sort of numb myself through a variety of, not very healthy tools and avenues, so that I would feel less. And I sort of succeeded. I was able to disconnect from my emotional state, from my empathy, and I was able to sort of fit in and become one with the herd in a way. And I realized many years later, when I really started doing my personal work and being on this path of pretty rapid, accelerated personal transformation, which I've now been on for the past decade, that in that process of trying to separate from essentially my true self, which was this deeply empathic, feeling, sensitive being, I also disconnected from some of my greatest superpowers, namely my intuitive intelligence, my sensory intelligence, the intelligence of my body, my somatic intelligence. And I started living, like many of us do, really in my intellect. And my intellect became like this defense mechanism, this way of engaging with life where it could filter out any potential threats and deflect those and keep me safe from feeling pain. And it took me many years of doing deep personal transformational work, which I've now been doing for about 10 years, to really understand that even though in some ways I had succeeded, I cared less and I became more cool and therefore more popular and more accepted. Even though I got what I thought I wanted, I also lost something. There was a huge sacrifice that I made, which is that I wasn't able to feel as deeply. I wasn't as empathic. I wasn't as connected to all things. And so I lost kind of the juice of life. I lost the meaning of life. And so this fundamental disconnection with myself, with my spirit, with my intuitive intelligence, my emotional intelligence, and my somatic, my physical body intelligence, that disconnection and really living from the intellectual mind, using it as a defense mechanism to filter out anything that might be a threat so that I could remain safe, that was ultimately landing me in a place where I didn't feel fulfilled. And even when I had external success, which I did, as an actress in Hollywood, I was booking jobs, I was on TV shows, I was writing screenplays, I was producing content, I was living a pretty creative life, but something fundamentally was missing. And it was around 2014 that I started to go through this process of really reawakening this lost connection, reconnecting to these various intelligence systems. At the time, I didn't have the language to describe it in that way, but it really was kind of a step-by-step gradual process of discovering that there's all these different dimensions to me. I'm not one thing. I have all these different layers. And some of the parts of me that are the most powerful and the most able to ultimately manifest my purpose and have impact in the world, those were all connected to these aspects that I had rejected or pushed aside. And so it has been this process of essentially systemically unlocking and then integrating these various intelligence systems within myself. And once I reconnected sort of to what I call the ancient intelligence, which is like encompasses a lot of different intelligence systems, but is really this deep reconnection to the intelligence of life itself, recognizing that life is intelligent and that there is, whatever you might want to call it, a design, a patterning, a specific way that life communicates with us in order to give us curriculum so that we may evolve, so that we may grow from the challenges. Once I started trusting in that, and I started seeing that the more I leaned into my edges, the more I faced my fears, and the more I continued to do this inner work, the better my life got, the more magic I was experiencing, the more synchronicity, the more flow state, the more alignment, the more intimacy with myself, with the present moment, with other people, the more opportunities, the more success in all ways, material success, financial success, romantic relationship success started to just kind of happen. I recognized that I need to devote my life to this. Like, this is not something that I can keep to myself anymore. And that feeling of a lack of fulfillment that had been really driving me in my default intelligence state ultimately became satiated from within. All of these things that I had been looking to ultimately fulfill me from the outside, I realized they were all dead ends. And through the internal work, I was able to start to source that from just inside myself, through my breath, through my connection to my own inner knowing. that was ultimately how I ended up here to talk to you about, these sort of systemic challenges that many of us face, and many of us are questioning this default intelligence, this default way of operating. So I want to get into that a little bit more, and I want to explain kind of what is default intelligence and how does it relate, if you put it side by side with integrated intelligence. How do those look side by side? What are some of the belief systems that we have, that we carry, depending on which intelligence we're predominantly operating from? So once again, isolating these sort of core themes of distraction, isolation, and fragmentation, if those are sort of the main pieces that we want to be looking at in our human experience, individually and collectively, then the antidote to those things, the opposite of those things, would be beauty, connection, and integration. So let me explain what I mean by that. First of all, distraction and beauty, how are those connected? Well, I would say distraction ultimately is the very thing that disconnects us from the beauty that's already here, right? So it is the thing that's blocking us from actually receiving true beauty. But if you think about beauty, it has and always will be really an expression of the sacred. Beauty can be an access point into the energy of the sacred. And ultimately, I think that's what we're all longing for, is meaning through seeing the perfection of all things. And that means seeing the beauty in the pain and the bliss and the grief and the gratitude and everything in between. Beauty is also a survival mechanism. Evolution has used beauty as a way to preserve life since the beginning of time. If you look at the way the rose blooms to attract the bee, the pollinator, or anything in nature ultimately is using beauty as a technology for survival. This is an important thing to remember, especially as we are questioning our own ability to survive this next chapter of our human experience. So what role does beauty really play for us in this moment? I think it's an important conversation to sit with. Connection ultimately is, how do we relate with ourselves, with each other, with life itself? How do we create intimacy? Because intimacy is the juice of life. And intimacy is being able to show up in full presence without any distraction, without any guards, without anything protecting our heart, so that we can be fully available to receive whatever life has to offer us. Connection would be the polarity to isolation. And then lastly, fragmentation. The polarity, the opposite, the antidote to that, we call that integration. So integrating all of these various intelligence systems that we've been talking about. How do we incorporate them? How do we actually embody them? How do they become a part of our way of being so that it's as second nature as riding a bike or tying our shoelaces? That ultimately is the path from default intelligence to integrated intelligence. Now, I acknowledge that I say we a lot when I'm talking about humanity, us human beings, the species, 8 billion humans alive on planet Earth today. And I'm aware that we're not all the same, but we are uncannily similar. And what I've learned from being a facilitator of transformational processes for the last 10 years is that no matter how far apart our lives may look on paper, whether we're successful in business and made millions of dollars, or we're, starving artists trying to figure it out, the universal themes that connect us show up again and again and again. And we are all dealing ultimately with the same wounds. And we're all really operating inside of similar belief systems. So I want to unpack kind of what the belief systems might look like for default intelligence versus integrated intelligence. So for default intelligence, some of the belief systems that we might have adopted knowingly or unknowingly is that success is a byproduct of intellect. Meaning, I think, therefore I am. This is sort of a fundamental approach, an outlook on life. It's so intrinsic that we often don't even question it. Our entire school system is essentially designed to foster and cultivate our intellectual, our rational capacities, our ability to problem solve, to project into the future. These are all very, what we call alpha qualities. They're not wrong or bad, they're super important. We need logic and reason and rationality. We need all that. But that isn't all that we are. We are so much more than that. And so we get lost in the story that the thinking, rational, intellectual mind is what defines us as a human being. And this limits us dramatically. It also makes AI competitive with us, because AI is really good at all that. Like, extremely good at that. Empirically better and faster at human beings at doing that. I think AI can do a math equation 10,000 times faster than a human being. And that's only right now. It's only going to become exponentially more efficient. So we can't really compete with AI in that arena, which forces us to really look at what are the other intelligence systems that are uniquely human. And we'll do that in a little bit. Another belief system of default intelligence is really this equation that more equals better. And this is so deeply anchored and rooted in our capitalist culture in the Western world that we don't see it's there. We just operate in this sort of hunger, this need for more, bigger, faster, better. How can we be more efficient, more productive? And this even applies often to our personal work and our spiritual path. How can I become more spiritual? How can I become more realized in my full potential? How can I biohack my way to even more superhero qualities? I think we get to look at that. I think we get to question whether more is always better. Another belief system is that our self-worth is sourced externally. So our level of worth, of how we perceive our worthiness, is very much directly tied to the external accomplishments that we achieve, that society has recognized as being valuable. And then this is another systemic belief system of default intelligence, which is that humans are superior to nature or to other species, that we are dominant, that we get to have the priority, and that we get to extract, we get to take whatever we want in order for our life to be comfortable and fully actualized, even if that means others need to suffer, namely the planet and various other species that we also share this planet with. So all of this is programming, right? We've been programmed with this default intelligence. It's kind of like you get an iPhone and you unpack it and, it comes with certain apps already pre-installed. Well, those are there. Maybe they're not everything you want the phone to be, but it's what you're working with until you decide to either delete those and install new ones or ultimately to customize your own experience. So think of default intelligence like that. It's not wrong or bad. It's just what we inherited when we grew up in this modern culture. Now, the beautiful thing is that many of us, and I'm guessing you're here because you're one of these humans, are kind of over this limited definition of what it means to be human. Default intelligence isn't cutting it for you anymore. You're feeling like you actually would like to really explore all the frontiers of what's possible and available to you. So this is what Joseph Campbell calls the archetypal hero's journey, sort of call to adventure, right? This is when we go on the journey and we say, okay, I'm complete with default intelligence, I want something more. And this is when it really gets fun, right? Because now we get to start to unlock and unpack all of this thing that makes up who we are or who we thought we were. This also means starting to sort of unwind all this programming around being this hyper-productive person and always needing to accomplish and achieve and being in this constant alpha mindset. And instead, we start to go into more of the omega, what we call the omega energy, which is the intuitive intelligence, the emotional intelligence, the spiritual intelligence, that feeling of oneness, that embodied intuition, all of that yummy, juicy stuff that has been sort of suppressed in our culture can start to come online and be unlocked. Now, that process generally doesn't happen in a vacuum, generally doesn't just come from reading a book. Generally, it requires going out into the world and actually engaging with life and taking risks and having teachers and guides and going through transformational processes that can be difficult and require us to feel a lot of really hard feelings and ultimately open us slowly but surely to a new way of doing life. And this is where we now get into the fun part, which is the integrated intelligence piece. So what are some of the belief systems that one might have when operating from integrated intelligence? Well, one of them would be that success, unlike default intelligence that says success is really a byproduct of intellect and achievement, in integrated intelligence, success is ultimately trusting your intuition. In comparison to default intelligence, where more equals better, in integrated intelligence, the belief system might be alignment equals better. Like, I don't need everything. I just need the things that are right for me, and I need the right amount of those things. I don't need too much, I don't need too little. I just want resonance. I want to feel in alignment with life. I want to feel like life is harmonic, like I'm playing my part, contributing my note into the larger symphony of life. And there's a coherence that comes from that way of living. There's a flow state that comes from that way of living. Another belief system is self-worth equals self-love. And self-love must come through knowing thyself. We can't love ourselves if we don't know ourselves, right? Just in the same way that we can't truly love another person if we don't really know them at their innermost core. We must go on that journey of really coming home to ourselves, of getting to know ourselves, not just the pretty parts, but especially the parts that we've decided are not worthy of love or that we've rejected or abandoned along the way. And then, in contrast to default intelligence, where we say humans are above nature, humans are superior to the natural world, here humans are interconnected with all of life. And we are students of nature. We are apprentices of the larger cosmic forces that shape our reality. When all of these things come together, and we're living in this state of integration, there aren't these parts of ourselves that we've fractured off, that we've forgotten about, that got lost somewhere in a traumatic moment in our childhood. But they're all included. Every part of us is included. We can show up in wholeness. And that ultimately also leads back to the intimacy that we crave and the connection that we crave. Because only if I bring my full self to you, can you fully meet me with your full self. And that's when we can go deep. And I think depth is ultimately, especially in our mindless scroll culture, what we're all looking for. Now, shifting from default intelligence to integrated intelligence isn't something where you snap your fingers and overnight you're there. Again, it's really not about getting anywhere. It's really more about being right here, right now. Ultimately, that journey is a deeply personal process. It's going to look different for everyone, and it's delicate, and it requires support, and it requires guidance. And more than anything, it requires being surrounded by people who are also on that journey, who are also asking those difficult questions and also willing to go into those uncomfortable places. Because there's absolutely no way to tap into integrated intelligence without being willing to feel all the shit that you didn't want to feel up until now. Literally, that might be the greatest superpower that any human being can unlock, is willingness to feel and ultimately release the more dense energies that are keeping us in certain holding patterns and certain ways of being that are pulling us out of alignment with the rest of creation. So we're gonna hopefully be able to provide that reference point for you by giving you access to the people that are on this path, that are having these conversations, and that are looking at this journey from default to integrated intelligence through their unique lens, their unique expertise that they might be bringing. Regardless of whether that's in the scientific realm or the spiritual realm or the transformation realm or the culture realm, there's so many different conversations that can ultimately weave around this subject. So I'm excited to welcome you to this podcast. I'm thrilled to be able to dive into these juicy subjects with you. I hope you found some value in what I shared today, and I can't wait to continue on the path. Much love.